The Manchester Man by Mrs. George Linnaeus Banks. Chapter 43. Partnership. By dint of persuasion, old Mrs. Clews was induced to place her well-saved brocade at the table, graced by the wedding cake she had manufactured, though, as she afterwards said confidentially to Jabez, "I must have had as much brass in me face as I had in me pocket to sit down, cheap bidjowl with grand folks with fine manners, who might come into me shop next day to be served with a pound of gingerbread. But I'd not a messed Mester Ashton's toast for summat, and I don't know as anybody turned up a nose bout it were that spark Aspinall, who owes me for many a quarter a pound of humbugs." Round that hospitable and substantial wedding breakfast, which owed much of its success to the bride's own deft fingers, also gathered the Cloughs, who had watched the career of the bridegroom with interest from his cradle. Miss Clough as bridesmaid, Mr. John McConnell and Henry Liversidge, who had cultivated his friendship from their first introduction, John Walmsley and Charlotte, who privately chafed at his reception into the family, and Augusta, whose brilliancy was somewhat dimmed by the overt watchfulness of too courteous and attentive Lawrence. But there was no Ben Travis, and missing him, Jabez was disposed to gravity. But though there were uncongenial elements present, George Pilkington's cheery voice and lively sallies sufficed to set mirth afoot and keep her dancing, whilst Mrs. Ashton, stately and proverbial, seemed to share some pleasant secret with which Mr. Chadwick and her husband were on the qui-vive. It was the age for toasts and sentiments. Some smart and witty things had been uttered, but not until the cake was cut and commended, and a post-chaise at the door waited to convey the newly married pair to Carr Cottage, and the earliest friends of the bridegroom, did Mr. Ashton rise to his feet, snuff-box in hand, and, with a merry twinkle in his eye, propose "Success to the new partnership." "Stop, my friends," said he, as glasses were elevated in honour of the toast. "Perhaps I had better explain what is meant by the new partnership." "I should think that was pretty obvious," whispered Lawrence to his friend Walmsley across the table, but he changed his opinion presently. "There are partnerships for life," continued Mr. Ashton, "where the contract is attested in church, as we have had the pleasure of witnessing today, and, I am sure, with the best wishes for its success. And there are partnerships in business, which are usually signed, sealed, and attested in a lawyer's office, and it is to such a one I now refer, in conjunction with the former." He paused to consult his snuff-box, and smiled to see how suddenly inattentive heads were eagerly bent forward to listen. "It may not be generally known that my dear nephew, Jabez, at the close of his honourable apprenticeship, declining an eligible offer from brother Chadwick in order to remain with us," Walmsley and Aspinall exchanged glances. Mrs. Clews looked knowing. "It may not be generally known that he has a small amount of capital invested in our concern at present." "Small enough, I should say," muttered Lawrence. "Now, there being no likelihood that his son Richard will ever leave his ship for a warehouse, Mr. Chadwick proposed to take his son-in-law Jabez into equal partnership, considering his integrity, his business tact, and energy to be equivalent to capital." "Hear, hear," in which Mr. Chadwick's stumbling tongue was loudest, and "Success to the new partnership." The snuff-box closed, the bandana was disposed of, the speaker's beaming face was all in a glow. "Stop, stop, gentlemen, not so fast. You will have to fill your glasses afresh. We have not yet got to the new partnership." "What the devil is he driving at?" was Aspinall's polite query to Walmsley, who shook his head in token of ignorance. Brother Chadwick had concluded that Mr. Clegg was wholly without capital, whereas he happens to have more than £1,000 at his disposal. broadcloth made sudden acquaintance with chairbacks. George Pilkington grasped his friend's hand. There was a puckering of Mrs. Clew's wrinkles. There were lowering brows from Lawrence and John. And Mr. Clegg, being perfectly satisfied with his present investment, and anxious to join the gingham manufacturer, without quitting the smallware manufacturer, proposed, pinch of snuff, that the two concerns should be amalgamated, and he have a share. Gentlemen and ladies, the proposal was hailed as an inspiration, and as soon as the change can be legally effected, the firm will be gazetted as Ashton, Chadwick and Clegg. And now let us drink. Success to the new partnerships, matrimonial and commercial. Aspinall's voice alone remained silent amongst the enthusiastic cheers with which the toast was drunk. Ellen, with humid eyes, escaped to change her garments, and Augusta also rose. But as she passed the new Manchester man, around whom friends crowded with congratulations, she put out her hand with a smile and said, "Cousin Jabez, I wish success to both your partnerships with all my heart." Lawrence was at her elbow, apparently to lead her with courteous ceremony from the room, and whilst offering one hand with a graceful inclination of his head, he contrived with the other to pinch the upper part of her arm, and to whisper in her ear between his set teeth, "Damn you, madam, you shall smart for this." An irrepressible ejaculation of pain burst from her. More than one turned round. There was real concern on the brow of Jabez as he asked, "What is the matter, Mrs. Aspinall? Are you hurt?" She made light of it. "Oh, nothing, nothing. I struck my foot against a chair, that was all." But Jabez saw the white, frightened face, and felt there was something more, and that scared look haunted him for many a day. Lawrence attended his wife to the staircase, smiling blandly whilst within sight or earshot. Ere he left her at the stair-foot, he gripped her tiny hand till her jewelled rings cut the flesh, and the smile became satanic as he whispered, "You are discreet, madam. I charge you to remain so for your life." Once in Ellen's crowded bedchamber, she became hysterical, to her cousin's great grief, but she overmastered her emotion by a violent effort, excused it on the plea of recent indisposition, and was consoled by her mother and other sagacious matrons with the remark that such affections might be expected. The newly married pair were whirled away down Oldham Street and up Piccadilly. Old Mrs. Clews took her departure, and then Augusta, acting on Mrs. Clough's advice, lay on the drawing-room sofa to rest. Not until night did the guests depart, Mr. Liversidge being the first to retire. There was a late dinner at 6 o'clock, and when the gentlemen rose from their post-prandial wine and sought the drawing-room, all considerably elevated, Lawrence Aspinall was too intoxicated to move. The Aspinall carriage had been waiting an hour. The coachman and Bob the groom grew anxious and impatient about the horses. "Mr. Lawrence drunk? That matters now," exclaimed the latter. "Steve and me'll manage him." And taking the limp young Hercules between them, they somehow hauled him to the carriage, and ensconced him in one corner, with his head drooping on his breast. Augusta shrank from joining him, afraid lest he should awake to malicious consciousness on the road. "Oh, I dare not go on with him. Indeed, I dare not go on with him." "My dear," said her mother gravely, "I am afraid you must. A wife cannot absent herself from home because her lord and master indulges in too much wine, even though he may occasionally make a beast of himself. It is too late to think of this now. What cannot be cured must be endured. As you made your own bed, you will have to lie on it to the end. Those who leave the spring for the stream must expect muddy water. However, there is nothing so bad but it might be worse. Once is not always, and love overlooks lapses. Augusta's persistence that she dared not be shut up with him alone caused Mrs. Ashton to say, "Well, my daughter, the occasion has been so unusual that even your own father has taken more wine than his wont, or he might bear you company. That groom seems a steady man. Suppose he rides inside to support his master, and whatever you do, remember, when wine is in, wit is out. Silence is a wife's safeguard, and you will have to make the best of a bad bargain." A month back Augusta would have tossed her head and laughed lightly at her mother's pet philosophy. That night she rode home from Jabez Clegg's wedding feast with a groom and a drunken man, pondering whether spirited resentment or tame submission was her best course. The morning dawned on a wife pinched black and blue, with hardly strength or spirit to sob. Then followed a reaction and a period of remorseful, uxorious penitence, during which Lawrence submitted with a tolerable grace to a lecture from Mr. Aspinall senior, who saw that something was amiss, and chivalrous gallantry towards woman being part of this gentleman's creed, he did not spare his son. Nor did Lawrence spare himself. He knelt at his wife's feet, called her an angel, and himself a savage, implored her forgiveness, excused his jealousy on the ground of passionate love, lavished his means on extravagant gifts for her, and exhausted language in fair promises. But so proud was he of his wife's beauty that he must needs exhibit at theatre and assembly the jewel he had won, whilst the admiration she excited set his jealous brain on fire, and she paid the penalty in the silence of night, or even in the close carriage driving home. But his contrition and the old plea of excessive love for his jealous infirmity won her over, and not even Cicely more than suspected half his cruelty. Great preparations had been made at Whaley Bridge for the reception of Mr. and Mrs. Clegg. The factory windows were extra burnished. The landlord of the White Hart hoisted a flag. The mill hands lined the road to greet them. The avenue gate was thrown open that the chaise might drive on to the cottage. Somebody had put Crazy Joe into a new suit of clothes for the occasion, and he stood by the side of little Sime on the step of the Gothic arch, the greater child of the twain, to laugh and chuckle a welcome, as sincere in its way as the only greetings of the orphan's fosterers. It was a fine, stalwart young man, of open but grave countenance, around whom Bess threw her motherly arms, while Tom Hume helped the bride to alight and marshalled the way for the pair, who followed arm in arm into the house-place, where Simon, stiff with age and rheumatism, kept possession of the padded chair set apart for the sick or aged. In some way the knowledge that Mr. Clegg came as a master and not as a servant had preceded him. "Hey, Jabez, lad," exclaimed Simon, tears of joy coursing down his cheeks, "that I should ever live to see this day. Would anyone have thought as little lass that played with our Jabez and his toys, and kissed him when he were a babby, would come to wed him when he were a mon, and a gentleman into bargain? And now let thy wife go and tack off a police, while thou talks to me, who'll be tired with long journey, I reckon. There's a fire in best parlour, that's place for gentlefolk, and your supper's laid there." Old Simon naturally concluded that young lovers wanted no society but each other. On 5-year-old Sime such a consciousness had not yet dawned, and so he penetrated into the best parlour, and, much to the relief of the bridegroom, broke into that first domestic tete-a-tete to exhibit some wonderful pictures he had drawn with red ruddle picked from the gravel path. They had been at Carr Cottage little more than 10 days or a fortnight, the first week being wet. Jabez, without neglecting Ellen, busied himself with contemplated changes and improvements at the mill, and thus the great bane of the modern honeymoon was avoided. The occupation thus found for the mind and hand of Jabez at that particular epoch of his life was a blessing, for which Helen had need to be thankful in after years, if she had but known it. As it was, she did fancy he might have given her a little more of his time, and not have needed her suggestion to revisit Taxel and the spot where he had wooed her for another, and not for himself. Yet a very slight hint was sufficient, and, taking advantage of a clear dry day, the two retrod the old path by the Goyt, which awoke reminiscences that could but be flattering to that self-love of which every human being has a share. Sitting down as man and wife on the lightning-scathed tree trunk, which had never been removed, he remembered the confession wrung from her agony on that very spot. His arm stole around her waist in the pitiful compassion it evoked. A new emotion stirred within his breast. He folded his wife in his arms, and pressed upon her answering lips his first spontaneous kiss of dawning affection. Halfway home they were met by Crazy Joe, who had been sent to seek them. A consecutive message was beyond his grasp. All they could make out was, "Back, sharp, quick," and hastening on in alarm, they at length discerned Mr. Ashton at the gate, on the lookout. His pleasant nod was reassuring. "My dear," he cried to Ellen as they advanced, "Dick has got his promotion at last. Lieutenant Chadwick has been duly gazetted. Here is his letter to your mother, dated from Malc. Stop, my dear." Ellen had put out her hand for the thick, heavy missive. "A communication which called your old Uncle Ashton out of his way to act as courier is not to be dealt with lightly, and before it is read I must know whether you would rather be Mrs. Clegg or Mrs. Travis." Closer she clung to the arm of Jabez. "Oh, Uncle, how can you ask?" There was a sly gleam in the corner of his eye. "Ah, just so. That's it. How can I ask?" But his face sobered. He handed the letter to his new nephew. "Jabez, I think you had better carry it to your own room for private perusal. I will communicate its contents to all whom it may concern besides." Jabez had deep feelings, though he was not demonstrative, and long before he had mastered its contents, he was thankful for the delicacy which had spared him an open display of irrepressible emotion. The writer, who was stationed at Malta, after dwelling on his own promotion and answering sundry maternal questions relative to himself, went on to say, "And so our Nell's going to be married? Well, it's about time. She'll be 26 next April, or I've lost my reckoning. And so she was fretting herself to fiddle-strings for a fellow younger than herself and without a shilling or a name, when she might have had a finer fellow with name and shiners to boot. Bravo, Nell, for choosing a brave lad instead of a money-bag. She's the sister for a sailor, whatever Charlotte may think. But your story of the flood and the cradle, and your mention of Mr. Travis, coming both together, recall a story I had forgotten, which may perhaps furnish a name for Nell's hero of the Irk and Peterloo. We had a broad-set sailor on board the Royal Sovereign. It was always getting into scrapes for chalking caricatures of the officers on the bunks and cabin doors. But there wasn't a man fore or aft that hadn't at some time or other coaxed a picture or portrait out of him to send to mother or sweetheart, and never a jack-tar amongst them would split on good-natured Ben Travis." Down dropped the shaking hand that held the letter. Ben Travis? What strange coincidence was this? His father had been a Liverpool shipbroker, and Ben took to me because I was a Lancashire lad like himself, though he was old enough to be my father. He'd been pressed, and as I was the youngest middy and he the master of the forecastle, many a time had he told me the sad story of his life. His father had died without a will, and Ned, his eldest brother, had laid his clutches on everything but £100 or so, which had been the mother's. Ben turned his back on Liverpool and his brother, and being smart with his pencil, took to that to get a living. He wandered about to pick up bits of scenery, and at Crumpsall fell in with a widow and her daughter, both named Anne Crompton, and went to lodge with them. After a while he married the lass, and thinking if he meant to earn a living for his wife and the child that was coming, he'd best seek a large town, he removed to Manchester and took an old cottage in Smedley Vale, where he hoped to turn his talent to account. The paper rattled and Jabez leaned against the window frame, as much for support as light, as he read on with panting lips. He tried portrait painting, but lacked a patron. He turned his head to pattern designing, but no one would employ a raw beginner. His money was dwindling and a birth was near at hand. He doted on his wife, and for her sake wrote to his brother, who was married when their father died. Ned wrote back enclosing a banknote and begging to see him at once. His wife had died, leaving a baby boy, whom he'd christened Ben after his runaway brother. Ned said that her loss was killing him, and he wished to leave his boy in his brother's care before he died. Poor Ben Travers kissed his wife and went by coach to Liverpool. Before he could reach his brother's office in Castle Street, near the docks, he was pounced upon by a press gang, dragged on board a ship in the Mersey, and never saw brother or wife or home again. I've seen Ben's tears roll down his weather-beaten cheeks many a time as he told this. He was one of the first sent down to the cockpit at the Battle of Trafalgar, and when Admiral Nelson's glorious remains went home to be buried, Ben went likewise to hospital, and I lost sight of him. When I was exchanged to the Excellent, Ben turned up again, hearty, but aged with grief. He had sought his dear ones, but a flood had swept through Smedley Vale in 1799 and left no trace of his own. A man at the dye works remembers something about an old woman they called Stiff-backed Nam being killed by the falling house in trying to save a baby. But Ben could learn no more, and his own impression was that wife, child and mother-in-law had perished in the same catastrophe. He went to Liverpool. Death had swept off his brother. Executors swept off the son, Ben, his namesake. He went back to sea, and I saw the brave Ben Travis drowned in trying to save a bumboat woman who fell overboard off Spithead. And now, mother, you used to be a good hand at patchwork. Piece my story and your story together, and see if Ellen's poor cradle friend is not near of kin to your rich friend Mr. Benjamin Travis, with quite as good a right to be called Mr. Travis too. I should have a rough sketch of the old sailor, drawn with a quid of backer on the fly-leaf of his prayer book. I'll look it up for now. Chapter 44. Man and Beast. The January twilight had deepened into dusk, and from dusk to dark, before Jabez was sufficiently master of himself to descend into the light of the rooms below. Whatever of surprise or satisfaction Richard Chadwick's letter had held for him, a wave of sorrow had passed over soul and countenance for the sad fate of the parents, whom he'd never known. As his footstep was heard overhead, Ellen flew to meet him at the foot of the staircase, and threw herself into his arms. "My love, my own husband," was all she said, but such an intensity of devotion and sympathy was in the act and tone that he felt he had indeed a true heart beating with his as he held her close, and his lips touched her forehead as a seal to a new bond. It was but a single step to the parlour door, which opened on a room all aglow with light and radiant faces. On Mr. Ashton's inspiriting, Simon's easy chair had been wheeled in from the house-place, there being no stately Mrs. Ashton at hand to demur at the innovation, or to whisper a syllable of class distinction. And surely that was not, yes it was, Ben Travis himself standing by the rheumatic old tanner with both hands outstretched to greet a new cousin in his long-time friend. And there was Bess, proudly glancing from his face to a piece of yellow paper. "It's as like as 2 peas," she cried for the 20th time, handing to her tall foster son a sketch which, though little more than a succession of brown smears, was a ludicrous resemblance to himself. "Well, Jabez," said Mr. Ashton, sitting by the fire with his handkerchief over his knee, after the first hubbub of congratulation had subsided, "it is well our new partnership has not been gazetted. I suppose there will have to be a change of name, and Ellen there will be Mrs. Travis after all." This was but a playful sally on his part, but Ben Travis visibly winced, and quick-eyed Jabez saw it. "No, sir," replied Jabez calmly, with his hand on his wife's shoulder. "There will be no change. I bear the name of the kind friends who saved my infant life, fed, clothed, and kept me, through evil report and good report, through pinching poverty, privation, and pain." He glanced towards Bess. "As Jabez Clegg I was enrolled as a blue-coat boy. As Jabez Clegg I was apprenticed to you, sir. As Jabez Clegg I married my wife. As Jabez Clegg I have been honoured with a place in your firm, and Jabez Clegg shall go with me to the grave. I had no name when that good man," pointing to Simon, "lent me his. Time has made it mine, and I mean to keep it as honourable as it came to me." He looked down. "Mrs. Clegg, are you content?" "Perfectly, Jabez." A long-sustained pinch of snuff spoke Mr. Ashton's approbation, while Simon could only reiterate, lad, when I took thee out at water, I little thought what a blessing there'd be to us, or the credit they'd bring on our name. I no but wish Parson Brooks were alive now to hear thee." "Our relationship will only bind our friendship closer, whatever name you bear," put in Ben Travis, warmly, in spite of himself, pleased with the decision, which would spare him the pain of addressing Ellen as Mrs. Travis. "And meals come round whatever name you call them by," supplemented Bess, who, like Martha, troubled with much serving, had been running in and out during the colloquy, whilst a combination of savoury odours and a clatter of knives and plates came from the adjoining room. "It's supper time now, and nobody's had even their tea yet." Just so, Mrs. Hume. But never mind the tea," said Mr. Ashton. "Here comes your good husband in from the cellar, with a bottle or two of generous wine to drink to new relationships." "I think I shall go abroad for a few months, cousin Jabez," said Travis to him as Mr. Ashton mounted first into the gig to return home to Manchester the next day. "I require to dissipate thought. If I were occupied as you are from morning until night, there might be less necessity. But, I say, Chapman the landlord here tells me you painted his sign. I think the faculty must run in the blood, for I do a bit in that line myself sometimes. How is it I have not seen a brush in your hands latterly?" "Well, I got a hint, through painting that very sign, that trade and art were incompatible, and seeing the force of the remark, has counselled the cobbler to stick to his last. Look you, cousin," Travis seemed fond of the word, "the fabled shield had two sides. Stick to your trade if you like, but don't let your trade absorb you. A businessman who allows himself no leisure, and has no resource out of his business, is apt to degenerate into a money grubber. I hope better things of you." A nod, a shake of the hand, the gig rolled off with its occupants, and Jabez stood looking after them, hesitating whether to go back to the mill or to the cottage. The casual word of warning had come not one whit too soon. That which was sending Travis abroad had kept Jabez close to business. He had not sought so much to dissipate thought as to circumvent it by substitution. If he had given his leisure to the cultivation of art, it had of late been art only as connected with manufacture and money-making. Even his honeymoon he was casting into the miller's grist. He was ever ready to take a hint. He turned his steps towards Carr with something like a sigh. "Well, perhaps I might as well give my afternoons to Ellen whilst we are here. I did not come to work, and the poor thing does need some compensation for the lack of a lover's ardour. God forbid that she should ever suspect that I married her out of pity, or that I should become a money grubber. I wonder if Travis thought I was likely to neglect her. It is 1,000 pities she should set her mind on me instead of him, and why she should passes my comprehension. He has every advantage of face, figure, and fortune, to say nothing of his evident devotion. Ah, women are strange creatures, and men are not much better. I fear I am very ungrateful not to reciprocate her attachment more fully. Why, here she is running down the avenue to meet me, as if I'd been gone a month. I really ought to love her better than I do, but love can neither be forced nor crushed, hey-ho. Back to Manchester they went rather sooner than expected, and then, though Jabez threw himself into business with a will, he bore in mind the parting words of Ben Travis. The contemplated amalgamation was effected, not without extra drafts on Jabez and his leisure, but as partner of a large firm, even though a junior, it was obvious he could not work as designer for calico printers or for any other than their own house. Consequently, not being a man of pleasure, his evenings hung rather heavily on his hands, especially as neither Ellen nor he cared for the card parties which formed the visiting staple. His very marriage had driven away his closest friend, and broken in upon plans and schemes which otherwise would have found sufficient occupation for his spare hours. Other friends, however, dropped in for an occasional chat, notably George Pilkington, to whom the wine trade had opened a road to fortune. With his reminiscences and jocularity broke in on the monotony of married life, that monotony which is as much to be dreaded by young couples as is a first quarrel. Ellen knew it not, but Augusta's image often and often rose up between husband and wife, and would not be driven back, whilst Ellen's very caresses were a source of pain to him, so much he felt himself a debtor to her love. There was a void in his breast which she could never wholly fill. He himself complained of a dearth of intellectual recreation, and when Henry Liversidge suggested a return to painting, he fell back upon his advice. The fact is, he needed to be alone, to have a place where he could shut himself up with himself, whether to indulge in daydreams, or to discipline his soul, or to think out the ideas of art, trade, or social economy, which floated through his brain and were dispersed by actual business or fireside chat. Such a sanctum as had been his so many years in Mosley Street, but, self-conscious, he had shrunk from making the proposal, afraid to wound his devoted wife by showing a desire to isolate himself. The young artist's open remark was enough for Ellen. At once a small room, or rather closet, partitioned off from a large one at the top of the house, was set apart for his use. He shelved one wall for books, set up an office desk, carried thither easel, papers, and painting materials, enclosed the flyleaf of his father's prayer book within glass and a black frame, suspending it on the wall before him as a sacred relic, and there, after warehouse hours, he was wont to shut himself in, and almost forget that he was a married man, but this room acted as a safety valve. Luckily, in Ellen's eyes, Jabez could do no wrong. He was gentleness itself in all his comportment towards her, and the love which had sprung to life unsought and lived so long without encouragement asked but slight return to sustain it. It was treason for Mrs. Chadwick to hint that Jabez was unsocial, or gave them too little of his company. She was ever ready to resent it with the reply that, if he is not dull shut up there by himself, I am sure we three have no right to complain of dullness down here together. Yet, if we analysed her heart very closely, there were longings and yearnings for his society, known only to herself. It was judged advisable for the further introduction and extension of Ashton, Chadwick and Clegg's business that one of the partners should travel occasionally as their commercial representative, and naturally this duty devolved upon the active junior, whose capacity for the undertaking revealed itself not only in heavy remittances and a full order book, but in a paucity of bad debts. Of course he travelled with a horse and gig for the carriage of samples, and now and then he would take Ellen with him on a short journey, an indulgence which appeared to fill the cup of her delight, and altogether the marital yoke in a few months adjusted itself to their shoulders very naturally. It was during their absence on one of the earliest of these journeys that an event occurred which set the indignant blood of Jabez on the boil, and showed there was a fire smouldering, not extinguished. The Aspinall home at Fallowfield was an ancient, many-gabled grange, with mullioned windows, recessed window seats, expansive two-leaved entrance arched above, noble hall, with trophies from the hunting field, grand staircase with massive carved oak balusters, flights of broad low steps, and wide square landings, long corridors, 3 or 4 rooms of magnificent proportions, and clusters of little ones grouped around unsuspected passages and stairs, open fireplaces recently enclosed, and double doors to the chief chambers. Antiquity had set its seal upon the place, and filled the panelled rooms with quaint or obsolete furniture and adornments, as each successive generation had left its quota. High-backed chairs, sofas of grotesque device, with dim worsted work cushions and covers, heavy draperies of silk or velvet, and tables with legs of all possible patterns. It had come to the former Mrs. Aspinall from her ancestors, and from her to her son on his marriage. Consequently, this was the home proper of Lawrence and his wife, although they had a suite of rooms set apart for them at Ardwick, and Mr. Aspinall would fain have had his fascinating daughter-in-law abide there always, instead of making his house a mere convenience for visiting in town. Stabling and other outhouses were attached. The gardens were well laid out. There was a good quantity of grassland, all enclosed within a high wall, and it lay away from the main road. Mr. Aspinall's carriage was a closed one, for service as well as show. Mr. Lawrence, on his accession to his mother's property and his wife's dowry, added to other extravagances, not a light carriage, but a new Tilbury, and astonished the crowd by driving tandem. Whitsuntide is the great annual festival in Manchester. It is the race week, the time when the Sunday school children dress in their best to walk in procession and have excursional treats into the country. In 1823, Whitsunday fell on the 18th of May, when the hawthorn scented the air and cherry blossoms snowed on the carriage which Mr. Aspinall sent for his daughter-in-law, that she might witness from his drawing-room windows the interesting spectacle on the green, and preside over the hospitalities of his open house during the week. At that time, as now, Monday was the day set apart for the children of all the established church schools to assemble at the collegiate church, sing anthems, and thence defile in long processions 6 abreast, attended by their respective clergy and teachers, until they reached the green, where the girls in their white caps and frocks were ranged within the enclosure round the pond, the boys forming a dark cordon around them, and the crowd a motley one beyond, and then from the multitudinous young throats poured forth anthems of praise in a volume of swelling harmony, which hushed to silence the listening birds above them. Augusta, not in robust health, lay on a couch by the window, and looked on, her father-in-law watching her, and anticipating her wants with the homage of old-world gallantry, for young Mrs. Aspinall was becoming an important person in his eyes. Nor was Lawrence much less attentive. He had been on his best behaviour for some time, and would scarcely let the wind of heaven blow too roughly upon her. At that period Manchester races were held on Kersall Moor, an extensive tract of land generously set apart for the purpose by the owner, Miss Byrom. The glass of fashion and the mould of form was the handsome man who patted Augusta's shoulders and stooped down to kiss her on Wednesday, the first race day. But it was with something more than a shade of anxiety she saw him draw on his buckskin gloves, take the long reins and mount his high Tilbury, with Bob beside him, and dash round the lower end of the green at a canter. Evening came to verify her fears. Back from Kersall Moor came the tandem and the tandem's master, but the biped was Sybrius. He was in that stage of self-satisfied elation which a contradictory word would change to fierceness, and the whim of the hour was to drive his wife to Fallowfield and show her how dexterous a whip he was, and that not Duckrow could manage a tandem better than he. It was in vain she, or his father, pleaded her delicate health, the height of the vehicle, the shaking she would sustain. He laughed at her fears, then fiercely insisted, and not daring to disobey, she was hoisted to her perilous seat. In much alarm, Mr. Aspinall mounted Bob on a saddle-horse to follow. The roads were dotted with vehicles and people, the latter shouting and singing or muttering tipsy oaths as the fortune of the day inclined them. Lawrence proved his dexterity in guiding his far-off leader through all intricacies, but so close did wheel often come to wheel that Augusta's heart seemed to leap into her throat, and her teeth chattered, although it was May. After they turned off from the Stockport road at Longsight, they spun along at a rattling pace, as he said, but she had to hold by the rail to keep her seat, notwithstanding which, at the sharp angle by Birchfold, the vehicle gave a lurch which almost pitched her off. At their own gate there was an abrupt stoppage for opening, their return being unexpected. Then the foremost horse refused to obey the rein and canter up the drive. Lawrence plied his whip, which did not mend the matter, and, but that Bob and the gardener were there to soothe the animals and lead them to the house, worse might have followed. As it was, Mrs. Lawrence Aspinall was half dead with fear and the shaking. She was lifted down and carried almost insensible into the house. Cicely and one of the maids got her to bed, whilst Aspinall himself, calling groom and gardener from the stables into the drawing-room, sat down to have a drinking bout with them. Presently Cicely put a white face in at the door, and beckoned forth Bob, whom no drink seemed to affect, and sent him off as fast as 4 legs could carry him, to bring back a doctor, and acquaint Mr. Aspinall and the Ashtons that his young mistress was very ill. In less than might have been expected, Mr. Aspinall's carriage brought to the Grange that gentleman, Mrs. Ashton, and Mr. Windsor, a young Quaker practitioner from Piccadilly. A competent nurse from the infirmary was on the box. There was no doubt she was in a critical state, but the immediate danger was warded off, and though Augusta was not able to leave her room in the interim, the scent of June's roses came in at the open windows before her baby was born, when penitent Lawrence went into raptures over wife and son. For 2 or 3 days he hovered about the house, nervously anxious lest any sound should disturb the young mother. He saw that every domestic was shod with list, stopped the great hall clock, and had the rolled-up carpets laid down on the polished oaken stairs. 4 days sufficed. On the 5th he rode off to town on Black Ralph on a pretence of business, but very little did Cannon Street see of Mr. Lawrence that day. With every acquaintance he met was a glass to be drunk to wet the child's head. At the Scramble Club, where he dined, he paid for 2 or 3 bottles of wine, also to wet the child's head, according to the practice of the club. Riding home he stopped at the George and Dragon, Hardwick Green, and went through the same process. There someone remarked that he was too drunk to stand, much less ride home, when he swore with an oath that he would show them how he could ride. He and Black Ralph were equal to anything, and then, amid roars of derisive laughter, he flung out another oath, and laid a wager which was regarded merely as the boasting of drunken braggadocio. He had kissed his wife's pale lips on leaving in the morning, and she faintly implored him to be home early. She did not dare add, and sober. Towards nightfall she began to listen for his return. Hour after hour went by, and at 1 in the morning she heard the great gates and the door thrown open for their impatient master by the watching servants, and the strong steed come tearing up the gravel, aye, and on up the broad flat steps, clattering through the great oaken hall, and urged with whip and spur and a madman's voice, mount the freshly carpeted stairs, cross the landing at a stride, and driving back the affrighted nurse, enter that sick chamber where, with a baby at her side, lay the fair young wife, gasping and shrinking with terror, and there stand with quivering flanks and panting nostrils, as the reckless rider on his back cried in exultation, "By God, I've done it!" He had done it. No matter what noise accompanied the removal of horse and rider, the wife, whom in his sober hours he professed to love so passionately, lay insensible to sight or sound, and wakened only to a morrow of delirium. Chapter 45. Wounds inflicted and endured. The spark lies cold in the flint until it is struck, and Ellen had not believed her quiet husband capable of so much passionate indignation as burst from him on the receipt at Sheffield of the details just given. "Brute! Ruffian!" burst from his lips as the letter he had crushed in his grasp fell to the floor, and with a stamp he rose to his feet, pressed one hand across his knitted brows, and paced the dingy carpet from end to end in a state of restless perturbation, his wrath finding vent in epithets and invectives foreign to his tongue. "Whatever is the matter, Jabez, love?" Ellen asked in amazement. "Oh, Ellen, dear, that brute Aspinall!" He could get no further. Feeling choked his utterance. She picked up the crumpled letter, and with almost equal exasperation and pain made herself mistress of its contents, in her womanly indignation and love for her cousin, losing sight of her husband's excessive emotion. Jabez left his journey unfinished, and drove back home with all speed. Helen shared with Mrs. Ashton and her own mother the anxious watch in that large dim room where the favourite of the family tossed her head from side to side and muttered incoherent words. In the sudden emergency, Bob, the old groom's recommendation of his own daughter as a wet nurse for the poor frail baby passed without cavil. Not until long afterwards was it known that Sarah Mostyn was the last woman to have entered that house, and on such a footing. 1 month, 2 months wore out before Augusta rallied, and Mr. Windsor, whose medical creed was to let nature take its course, pronounced her out of danger, and fit for the removal contemplated by her friends, and resisted by Lawrence. Double doors, however, could not exclude outer sounds, and so long as she shrank and shuddered at every crunch on the gravel, every echo of his raised voice, recovery was retarded. So the elder Mr. Aspinall, exasperated with his son, and most solicitous for the welfare of his son's charming wife, added his dictum to that of the doctor, offered his own carriage for her conveyance, and threatened to disinherit Lawrence if he interfered. Once in her childhood's home, she amended rapidly, but with increasing strength came maternal yearnings for her infant, still in charge of the wet nurse at Fallowfield. A hackney coach was sent to bring Sarah Mostyn with the child to its mother, but not a step would the nurse budge. She had no orders from her master, and the master paid her wages, and she shouldn't take orders from anybody else. Messages were sent and notes were written to Lawrence, which he tore to shreds, but he kept away from his wife, and kept back the child. At length she pined so much for her dear babe that Mr. Ashton and Jabez together sought Lawrence out in one of his haunts, a tavern near Cockpit Hill, to prevail on him to let Augusta have her boy with her. "Mrs. Aspinall herself deserted her child," he replied, all the more haughtily, seeing that Jabez was Mr. Ashton's seconder. "When Mrs. Aspinall thinks fit to return home to her maternal and wifely duties, she will find the nursery door open, and her son in trustworthy care. A true wife's place is by her husband's hearth." "Yes, sir, when the husband is a true man," replied Jabez with decision. "And who dares to say I am not a true man?" retorted Lawrence boldly. "I do," promptly answered the other. "No true man would have imperilled his wife's life by a reckless drive in the dark night in a tandem tilbury. Only a reckless madman or a ruffian would have forced a horse into a wife's sick chamber to drive her delirious with terror." "And pray, sir," haughtily responded the other, "how long has Mrs. Aspinall made you her confidant?" "I have not the honour of Mrs. Aspinall's confidence," answered Jabez sturdily, looking him full in the face. "Such facts are trumpet-tongued." "Just so," put in Mr. Ashton, drawing his arm through that of his junior partner. "And the fact that Augusta shrinks at your name has spoken so loudly to us that if ever she sits on your hearth again, it won't be with my consent. Come away, Clegg." After this declaration, Aspinall changed his tactics. He wrote to his wife, requesting her return, then entreating it, and finally went in person to beseech her to come back, vowing to atone for the past with the devotion of her life. The young mother yearned for her babe. The tender-hearted wife could not resist the appeal of the husband, whom, with all his faults, she yet loved, and, regardless of the previsions of her mother or the entreaties of her father, she allowed him to drive her home again to the Grange. Her first thought was the nursery, There she found, in addition to her own boy, drawing its sustenance from the nurse's breast, a well-dressed child some 2 years old, playing with a wooden milkmaid rattle on the rug. Something in the child's face and auburn curls made her ask, "Sarah, whose child is that?" "Mine, whose should it be?" was the pert answer, and the boldness of the woman's manner checked further inquiry. But Augusta's heart had received a shock which shook the pedestal on which her idol sat enthroned. For a short space Lawrence kept terms with his wife, and before her father or strangers he was her most devoted slave, but she underwent a species of slow torture in secret. She soon found that Sarah Mostyn was mistress of the house as well as of the nursery, and that Sarah Mostyn's child was of as much importance as her own baby boy. Then Lawrence filled the Grange with his riotous associates, and compelled his wife to do the honours of his table, though their wholesome conversation overpowered her with disgust, and, if one flushed with wine or more bold than the rest paid her a compliment or looked too warm an admiration, he was sure to find his way to her side with his common undertoned threat. "Damn you, madam, you shall smart for this," a threat always accompanied with sly pinches which left their marks beneath her sleeves. Then straightway, "My dear," or "My love," would be asked in the blandest of tones to sing a song, play a rondo, or perform some act of courtesy for the very guest who had excited his jealousy. They had few lady visitors. The neighbourhood was remote from town and sparsely inhabited. Mr. Lawrence Aspinall's reputation was as a yellow flag to warn gentlewomen who had daughters or husbands to lose against close intimacy with their neighbours of the Grange. Pitying the isolation of one so formed to adorn society, Mr. Aspinall gave mixed parties at Hardwick Green in the name of Mrs. Lawrence, when the splendour of her attire and the assiduous attention of her husband set rumour to contradict rumour. But save on an occasional family gathering, she saw few of her own sex at Fallowfield, and her position in her own home was rendered intolerable by the continued presence of Sarah Mostyn, who, at first familiar, then impertinent, had become at last openly defiant. It was not until all efforts to keep the nurse in her proper place had failed that Augusta appealed to Lawrence to discharge her, the woman having refused to take a dismissal from anyone but her master. "Phew," said he, "I'll soon settle that business," and forthwith stalked to the nursery, whence his voice was heard in loud command. But the result was not the woman's removal, only a temporary submission, to be followed by fresh rebellion, and the confirmation of Augusta's worst suspicions. How often did the aggrieved wife then recall her thoughtless declaration to her mother that her husband's heart must hold her, and her only, not even business to share in its possession, and how thankful she would have been to have had no rival then but business. She was finding the bed she had made for herself a woefully hard one, but she did not succumb readily. She had high spirits and a buoyant nature, and would hardly admit to herself how much she suffered or how great a mistake she had made. But Cicely, that most faithful of faithful followers, cognizant of her mistress's wrongs long before her mistress, paid Sarah Mostyn off in her own coin on various occasions, and took care that through one means or other the Ashtons should know what a life their darling led. Amongst his other little peculiarities, Mr. Lawrence was an epicure, and one of his favourite titbits was that spongy lining of a goose's frame known as the sole. It chanced at a family dinner, rather more than a year after Augusta's return home, that a fine stubble goose formed part of the bill of fare, and Cicely, who had long owed him a grudge for his heartless treatment of her young mistress, determined to pay him off and expose him before the whole company. A good caterer for a dainty palate, Cicely knew her power and privileges, but in this case she overshot the mark. One of the accomplishments of that generation was dexterous carving, and Lawrence prided himself on being able to dismember a large fowl without once shifting his fork. The goose was set before him, and duly carved. But lo, when his knife would fain have extracted his favourite morsel, it scraped bare bones. The flat bell rope was pulled violently. Cicely was summoned, and Cicely, in clean linen cap and apron, stood in the doorway, curtsying respectfully. "What have you done with the soul of this goose?" he demanded, in a tone of suppressed passion. Cicely came a step or two forward with an aspect of marvellous innocence. Sir, it's not a goose, it's a gonder, and gonders have no souls." Scarcely an individual present but took the covert innuendo, and glances were exchanged across the board, but the look he shot at the woman, as, incapable of speech, he waved her to retire, was one never to be forgotten, so much demonic wrath was concentrated therein. From the time when Jabez was acknowledged on 'Change as a Manchester man, was admitted into Manchester society, and had absolutely become a member of the same family as his son, Mr. Aspinall punctiliously invited him with his wife, and Lawrence, with widely different feelings, followed suit. It was not until after the noble exploit to which Augusta so nearly fell a sacrifice that Mr. Clegg could be induced so far to listen to Ellen's desire for conciliation, now that they were all of one family, as to accept one of these invitations. After that event, he was of Mrs. Ashton's mind that as offenders never pardon, Augusta needed a friend to watch over her. So he left his books and his brushes, and his schemes for the working class, amongst whom he had been reared, and, believing his growing affection for his wife and the babe she had borne him a sufficient guarantee to his own heart for his own good faith, when the Aspinalls next invited, he accepted. As previously stated, Augusta had not dropped into tame submission all at once. Her old wilfulness would have way at times, and the light shafts of her satire were frequently aimed with effect against her recalcitrant lord. More than once Jabez had averted disastrous consequences by checking her vivacity ere it went too far, but never had he been so thankful for his self-appointed guardianship as on the night when Cicely thought to pay back her darling's wrongs. To his surprise and pleasure, Ben Travis, just returned from the Continent, was of the party. He had not yet called on the family in Oldham Street, and Jabez never asked him wherefore. The cousins had much to talk over, and whilst Lawrence Aspinall was pouring wine on his wrath, they discussed a project in which Jabez took an interested part, and which eventuated the following year in the Manchester Mechanics' Institution. But through all their discussions, Jabez never once lost sight of Lawrence, and, from his excessively polite manner to her, augured ill for Augusta, when the restraining presence of friends was removed. He communicated his fears to Travis, and when the goodbyes were said and the various conveyances rolled out between the great gates, a fee to Luke the gardener, who was also gatekeeper, kept them open. A whispered word was sufficient for those who had seen the Luke Lawrence directed across the dinner table from Cicely to his wife, and who knew the character and disposition of the man. Mr. Travis's gig and the Ashtons' hackney coach were kept in waiting, close at hand. Mrs. Ashton and Ellen, well wrapped up within, waiting anxiously, for they knew not what. Back towards the closed house went Mr. Ashton and the cousins, treading carefully over the gravel. There was a flagged footway round the building, and from the windows of dining and drawing rooms light was still streaming. The last owner had lowered the middle window of the drawing room as a door of access to the lawn. As if by accident, the curtains had been dragged a little aside in each apartment, and now there were watchers at the apertures. The elder Mr. Aspinall had made an excuse and retired to bed early. Augusta, with a shawl wrapped around her, sat weeping on a sofa in the drawing-room, afraid to go to bed. High words had evidently passed, whilst those outside had made their arrangements at the gate. Presently into the dining-room sauntered Lawrence, with his arm around the shoulders of Sarah Mostyn, the shameless nurse. They sat down to the supper table. He poured out wine into a goblet, and they drank from the same glass. He fed her with delicacies, and kissed and caressed her with an assured familiarity which told it was no new experience. Long they lingered, drinking and dallying, and the watchers might have thought no danger need be apprehended. Suddenly a word of the woman's, like a match to petroleum, set the whole man ablaze. He rushed from the room with a loud oath, the woman after him, apparently in alarm. The movement her friends made outside in gaining the other window caused Augusta to raise her beautiful head, and at that moment her husband stood before her, brandishing his cavalry sabre, and with his eyeballs glaring, fiercely vociferating, "I'll teach you, madam, to set my servants to insult me." He made a fearful slash at her. As she sprang aside with a terrified shriek, the old woodwork of the glass door gave way, and before the tipsy madman could recover his guard to strike a fresh blow, his sabre was wrenched from him, and, himself struggling in the grasp of 3 powerful men, his own gardener being one. Poor Mr. Ashton's care was his stricken child, whose white shoulders, bathed in blood, were washed by her father's tears. Thankful then was Jabez to have been at hand, and on the alert, with so powerful an ally as Travis. Thankful to have saved Augusta's life at any sacrifice of personal feeling, and only himself could tell what his presence under that roof cost him. Even Lawrence had no inkling of it. The marriage of Jabez had closed his jealous eyes, but now, finding in his old opponent an unseen watcher over his wife, her defender, when he had least expected, his baffled rage was something terrible to look upon. He fought, struggled, vociferated, threatened, and foamed at the mouth, and Mr. Aspinall, coming thither in his dressing gown, aroused by the uproar, could barely master his indignation and disgust as he ordered the men servants, crowding in half-dressed, to help to bind that murderous maniac down. It was well too that Mrs. Ashton and Ellen were close at hand, and a vehicle ready to dispatch for a surgeon, for Augusta needed all their care. Before 3 days were over, there was a little coffin in the house, holding a stillborn child, and there was a young mother with a plastered shoulder lying white as her pillow in a state of coma. Dr. Windsor, having exercised his best skill, as was his wont, left nature to do the rest, and youth and nature between them did their work effectually. Fain would Mr. Ashton have removed his child once and for all. He offered to set up a carriage for her if she would but leave her husband and seek a legal separation, insisting that she owed her duty to herself as well as to her husband. Mr. Aspinall himself begged that she would take up her abode with him at Hardwick, if only for her own security. He had ceased to find excuses for his son, and his son's charming wife stood high in his esteem. But Lawrence had been beforehand, and with plausible promises and penitential tears, and an adroit parade of her little Willie, also in tears for mamma, won her over to pardon and to give him another trial. And not all Mr. Ashton's eloquence nor Mrs. Ashton's proverbial battery could win her from her decision. "My dear mother," said she, "remember you told me what could not be cured must be endured, and that as I made my bed so must I lie. 'Tis a long lane, mother, that has never a turn. I have heard you say many a time, and who knows but Lawrence may take a turn now, and reform. At all events it is my duty to give him a fair trial, and keep my own wayward nature in check, so as not to provoke him. And I must not leave Willie alone with that woman. I think Mr. Clegg would say I am right." I am afraid she overrated Mr. Clegg's magnanimity, much as she overrated her wild husband's promised reformation, for her decision struck a pang into the heart of Jabez, little dreamed of by Ellen. Indeed, it cost him a sore struggle to subdue his concern for Augusta, within the bounds of duty to his own wife, as many virtues were gradually winning their way into his heart, and towards whom his attention never relaxed.